police officers brutally arrest a black woman, not even realizing that she works for the government. Their bias and self-righteousness cost them big problems. Find out how she will get justice. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and write in the comments what you think about this injustice. Vivian Harris, a highly skilled FBI agent, had spent years honing her craft in the high-stakes world of undercover operations. She was no stranger to danger, having infiltrated criminal organizations and taken down notorious figures in the underworld. Her reputation within the Bureau was impeccable, calm under pressure, quick thinking, and relentlessly determined. But despite her achievements, she was often underestimated, both because she was a woman and because of the color of her skin. This new mission was one of the most dangerous she had ever undertaken. Vivian had been working undercover for months, slowly gaining the trust of a powerful weapons smuggling ring operating in the city. The group had ties to international arms dealers and was responsible for bringing illegal firearms into the country. It was her job to infiltrate their ranks, gather critical intelligence, and, when the time was right, assist the FBI in taking them down. She knew every move counted. Any misstep could cost her life. But Vivian had a proven track record of success in these situations. The mission had now reached a critical stage. Vivian had arranged a meeting to finalize the details of a large weapons shipment that was set to take place within the week. The intel she gathered from this meeting could lead to a massive bust, shutting down one of the city's most dangerous criminal networks. Tonight was pivotal, and she knew it. As Vivian sat in her car, a modest sedan that fit the look of someone living on the fringes of legality, she glanced at the dashboard clock. It was almost time. The meeting was set to take place in a dark alley behind an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Neutral ground, chosen to minimize suspicion and exposure. The streets were quiet, but the tension in the air was palpable. Vivian adjusted her disguise. Plain clothes, a worn-out jacket, and her hair tucked under a baseball cap. She looked like anyone else who might be lurking in these parts, blending in seamlessly with the environment, as was her specialty. In the trunk of her car were a few crates containing sample firearms, part of the deal she was about to broker with the smugglers. Everything had to appear legitimate. Her fingers tapped lightly on the steering wheel as she rehearsed her approach. The key to any undercover operation was remaining calm, collected, and convincing. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. One wrong word, one misplaced glance, and the criminals she had worked so hard to deceive would see through her facade. But Vivian trusted her instincts. She had been in dangerous situations before, and she had always come out on top. As the minutes ticked by, she noticed headlights approaching from the distance. The smugglers were on their way, but as she prepared to step out of her car and meet them, something unexpected caught her attention. Blue and red lights flashing in the rearview mirror. A police car. Vivian's heart sank. She wasn't supposed to attract attention, especially not from the local police. Her cover could be blown if she didn't handle this carefully. She stayed still, hoping they might just pass by, but to her dismay, the police cruiser pulled up behind her, its spotlight glaring onto her car. "Damn it," she muttered under her breath. This wasn't part of the plan. She quickly ran through her options. She could try to explain the situation, but the risks were high. If the police officers didn't believe her, not only would she be arrested, but her entire operation could be compromised. Vivian glanced at her FBI badge, which was hidden in the glove compartment. Pulling it out now could cause more harm than good. The last thing she needed was for word to get back to the smugglers that law enforcement was involved. No, she had to handle this delicately. A police officer stepped out of the cruiser. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with an intimidating presence. His partner followed, a shorter but equally stern-looking figure. Both had the hardened look of officers who were accustomed to dealing with troublemakers, and from the moment they laid eyes on Vivian, it was clear they viewed her as a suspect, not a citizen. "License and registration," the first officer barked, shining his flashlight into her window. "Step out of the vehicle." Vivian could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She knew that any wrong move could escalate this encounter into something far worse than a routine stop. "Officers," she began calmly, her hands raised slightly to show she wasn't a threat. "I'm an FBI agent, working undercover on an operation. This is all part of the mission. If you could just—" "FBI, huh?" the second officer sneered, cutting her off. "I've heard that one before. Step out of the car now." Vivian clenched her jaw. The tone in his voice made it clear that they weren't going to listen to reason. They had already made up their minds about her. She could see it in their eyes, the same look she had seen too many times before when dealing with law enforcement. They didn't see an agent doing her job. They saw a black woman in a rough part of town, and to them, that was enough to assume guilt. Reluctantly, Vivian stepped out of the car, her mind racing as she tried to assess the situation. The officers were tense, their hands hovering near their holsters. She had to be careful. "Hands where I can see them," the first officer ordered. Vivian complied, knowing that anything less could escalate the situation further. She kept her voice steady, though inside she felt the weight of frustration building. "Look, if you just check my credentials—" "Quiet," the second officer interrupted. He walked around to the back of her car and popped the trunk, ignoring her protests. Inside, he found the crates of weapons. "Well, well, what do we have here?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Looks like we've got ourselves an arms dealer." Vivian's stomach churned. This was bad, very bad. The weapons in her trunk were legitimate, but only because they were part of the sting operation. If the officers didn't back off, everything she had worked for would fall apart. "This is all part of a federal operation," she said through gritted teeth, struggling to maintain her composure. "If you contact the FBI, they'll explain everything." The first officer shook his head, his face twisted in a smug grin. "I'm not buying it. You think we're just going to let you walk away because you throw the FBI name around? Not happening." Vivian watched helplessly as they cuffed her, their rough handling making it clear they didn't care about her story. To them, she was guilty until proven innocent. As they shoved her into the back of the patrol car, Vivian's mind raced. She had to find a way out of this without blowing her cover, but with the weapons already found and the police convinced of her guilt, the situation had spiraled out of control. The meeting with the smugglers was ruined, the operation on the verge of collapse. And as she sat in the back seat of the patrol car, the cold steel of the handcuffs biting into her wrists, one thought kept echoing in her mind. "I can't let this end here." As the patrol car pulled away from the scene, the street lights flickering through the window, Vivian's thoughts shifted from the mission to the immediate problem at hand, how she was going to get out of this situation without everything falling apart. She needed to stay calm, but the growing anger at the injustice she was experiencing threatened to bubble to the surface. The officers weren't just arresting her. They were undermining months of painstaking work. And they didn't even care. But she couldn't afford to lose control, not yet. The real fight was just beginning. The patrol car sped through the city streets, the flashing lights casting red and blue reflections across the buildings. Inside, Vivian sat in the back seat, her wrists painfully cuffed behind her. She'd been in tough situations before, but this felt different. The frustration gnawed at her as the officers, oblivious to the magnitude of their mistake, chatted in low voices, occasionally glancing at her through the rearview mirror with expressions of disdain. Vivian took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The rough treatment was nothing new. She had seen it before, on the streets, in the news, in the very cases she worked on. But now, the weight of the handcuffs on her wrists was a physical reminder of just how quickly things could spiral out of control. She was a federal agent, someone who had sworn to uphold the law, yet here she was, treated like a common criminal. And all because these officers couldn't see past the color of her skin. Her thoughts raced as the car slowed down, pulling into the parking lot of a local precinct. The small building was bathed in the harsh glow of overhead lights, its walls marked with years of wear. Vivian knew that this was just the beginning of what could be a much bigger problem. She had to remain calm, calculated. Losing her temper now would only give these officers more power over her. The car jerked to a stop, and the officers, Johnson and Wilson, as she had learned from their brief conversation, got out. Officer Johnson yanked open the back door, his rough hands pulling Vivian out of the car without a word. His grip was tight, almost painfully so, as he led her toward the entrance of the station. Vivian's wrists ached under the pressure of the cuffs, but she said nothing. She had to play this right. Inside, the station was dimly lit and quiet, save for the hum of a distant television set and the faint murmur of voices from the bullpen. Officer Wilson led the way, his body language screaming arrogance as he gestured toward the holding area. "Take her back here," Johnson muttered, his voice low but laced with contempt. "We'll figure out what to do with her after we book her." Vivian's jaw clenched, but she remained silent. She could feel their eyes on her, judging her with every step. To them, she wasn't a federal agent on a critical mission. She wasn't someone who had spent months infiltrating a dangerous criminal organization. To them, she was just a suspect, another black woman in handcuffs. They took her through a narrow hallway lined with old, faded posters about crime prevention and police duty. The irony wasn't lost on her. As they passed a few other officers, she could hear their whispers, feel the way their eyes scanned her from head to toe. The humiliation was building, knotting in her stomach, but she couldn't let it show. She couldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. The holding room was small and cold, its metal benches bolted to the floor and the walls bare except for a cracked mirror. Johnson roughly pushed her into a seat and stood towering over her, his face smug as he crossed his arms. "You think you can just walk around, claim you're FBI, and we'll let you go, huh?" he sneered. "You're not the first to try that trick." Vivian stared at him, her heart pounding with anger. This was more than a simple misunderstanding. This was pure, unfiltered racism, and they didn't even try to hide it. "I am FBI," Vivian said, her voice steady but firm. "If you check my credentials—" "Shut it," Wilson interrupted, stepping closer. "You're not fooling anyone. You've got guns in your trunk. You're part of this whole operation, aren't you?" Vivian could feel the rage bubbling up inside her. They hadn't even bothered to properly investigate before jumping to conclusions. She wasn't just another suspect in a crime. She was the one who had been tasked with stopping it. But their bias, their assumptions about her, were clouding any sense of duty or justice they might have had. "Listen to me," she said, her voice sharper now. "If you don't let me contact the FBI immediately, you're going to ruin months of work. There's a federal operation at stake, and Johnson leaned down, his face inches from hers. "I don't care what you say. I know your type. You people think you can get away with anything, but not on my watch." Vivian recoiled inwardly at the venom in his words. "You people." It was all she needed to hear to confirm what she already knew. This wasn't just about suspicion or protocol. This was about her race, plain and simple. But she couldn't let her emotions take over. Not now. Not when so much was at risk. "You don't have to believe me," she said, forcing her voice to remain calm. "But if you don't at least run my name through your system, you're going to regret it." Wilson exchanged a glance with Johnson, his expression skeptical but slightly more hesitant than before. Johnson, however, seemed to be enjoying the power he held over her too much to consider the possibility that she might be telling the truth. "What's the matter?" Vivian pressed, sensing a slight opening. "Afraid you're wrong?" Johnson's face darkened, and for a moment, Vivian thought he might lash out. But then he straightened up, taking a step back. "Run her name," he ordered Wilson, his voice tight with frustration. "Let's see how much of this FBI crap holds up." Wilson moved to the desk, his fingers tapping on the keyboard as he entered her information into the system. The silence in the room grew heavy as they waited, the tension thickening with each passing second. Vivian's mind raced. If they didn't find her in the system, or worse, if they found a way to bury her information, it could spell disaster for the entire operation. Her team was depending on her, and if she didn't get out of this situation soon, the arms dealers she was after would disappear into the wind. The sound of Wilson's typing stopped abruptly, and both officers turned to look at the screen. Vivian's heart pounded in her chest as she watched their faces. At first, there was confusion, then a flicker of doubt. Wilson's brow furrowed, and he glanced back at Johnson, who crossed his arms tighter across his chest. "Well?" Johnson demanded, his voice dripping with impatience. Wilson hesitated. She's in the system. FBI." For a moment, the room seemed to freeze. Johnson's face twisted with disbelief, his arrogance slowly giving way to uncertainty. He looked back at Vivian, his eyes narrowing as if he were trying to figure out if this was some kind of elaborate trick. "No," Johnson muttered, shaking his head. "There's no way." "It's all here," Wilson said, his voice quieter now. "Her badge number, her clearance, she's legit." The anger Vivian had been suppressing flared up again. Of course she was legit. If they had just listened to her from the beginning, none of this would have happened. But now the damage was done. They had humiliated her, arrested her without cause, and all because they couldn't see past their own prejudices. Vivian stood up, her eyes locked on Johnson. "You've made a huge mistake." Johnson's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. He took a step toward her, but Wilson grabbed his arm, stopping him. "Let it go," Wilson muttered, his voice low but firm. "We screwed up." For a brief moment, Vivian thought Johnson might lash out again, his pride clearly wounded. But he stopped, his fists clenched at his sides. The arrogance in his eyes was gone, replaced by something darker: humiliation, anger, and fear of the consequences that would inevitably follow. Vivian's mind was already racing with what she needed to do next. She had to contact her team, salvage the operation if it wasn't already too late. But more than that, she needed to make sure these officers were held accountable for what they had done. They had abused their power, let their biases cloud their judgment, and nearly derailed months of critical work. She was tired of this. Tired of always being on the receiving end of these injustices, no matter how high she rose in her career. This time, she wasn't going to let it slide. As they removed the cuffs from her wrists, the cold metal clinking to the floor, Vivian rubbed her sore arms and looked Johnson directly in the eye. "This isn't over," she said, her voice icy. "Not by a long shot." As Vivian walked out of the precinct, her head held high despite the humiliation she had just endured, she knew that her fight was far from over. She had a mission to complete, both as an agent and as a person who had just faced another painful reminder of the systemic racism embedded in the very institutions meant to uphold justice. The operation might still be salvageable, but something much bigger was at stake now. The air outside the police precinct was cooler than before, but Vivian hardly noticed. Her mind was already racing through the next steps. The operation was hanging by a thread. If the smugglers had any sense of suspicion about her being caught by the police, they would scatter like cockroaches into the darkness, leaving her months of painstaking work in ruins. But as much as the mission mattered, there was something else now clawing at her mind, something personal. The anger from her wrongful arrest simmered just below the surface. The humiliation. The disbelief that, even after showing her badge and trying to reason with the officers, they had dismissed her as just another criminal. It was more than professional arrogance on their part. It was deeply personal, rooted in racial bias they didn't even try to hide. And Vivian wasn't going to let it go. As she walked toward her car, the same one those officers had rummaged through without a second thought, she pulled out her phone and called her superior at the FBI, Special Agent Andrew Scott. His gruff voice answered almost immediately. "Vivian, where the hell have you been?" Scott barked. "We've been trying to reach you. Is the operation still on?" Vivian took a deep breath, trying to contain the whirlwind of emotions. "I was detained, Andrew, by the police." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Detained? By the local cops? What the hell for?" "They didn't believe I was FBI," she replied, her voice laced with the bitterness of the experience. "Pulled me over, searched my car, found the weapons for the operation, and arrested me." Scott swore under his breath. "Jesus, Vivian, I'm sorry. That's unacceptable. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she said, though the truth was far more complicated. "But the mission is in jeopardy. I'm not sure if we can salvage it yet. I need to figure out how much the smugglers know if they saw the police presence." There was another pause before Scott spoke again, his tone softer now. "Look, let's not lose sight of the bigger picture here. If we have to, we'll rework the operation. I'll handle the fallout. But you, Vivian, you need to report this. What they did to you, it's unacceptable. This isn't just about the mission anymore." Vivian clenched her jaw, staring at the dim lights of the precinct behind her. She knew he was right. As much as she wanted to move on, to focus on the operation and the criminals she'd been after for months, this went deeper than that. It was systemic. The way those officers had treated her, the way they had dismissed her words without even considering the possibility that she was telling the truth, it was a reflection of a much larger problem, and she wasn't going to stand by and let it continue. "I'm going to file a formal complaint," she said finally, her voice firm with resolve. "But not just that. I'm going to make sure those officers are held accountable. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, and it sure as hell won't be the last unless we do something." Scott didn't hesitate. "You have my full support. And you know the Bureau will back you up. We'll take this as high as it needs to go. Let's expose them for what they are." Vivian nodded, though she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Exposing systemic racism and corruption in law enforcement was a battle that had been fought for years, and too often it ended with nothing more than empty promises of reform. But she was determined. She wasn't going to let these officers walk away unscathed, not after what they had done. She ended the call and took a moment to compose herself. There was still work to be done. The mission was hanging in the balance, but for now there was a much larger battle to fight. She was going to take those officers down, and she wasn't going to stop until justice was served. The next day, Vivian sat in the office of the FBI's Internal Affairs Division, her fingers tapping lightly on the arm of the chair as she waited. The room was sterile, with white walls and a simple desk at its center. She had been here before, but never like this. This time, she was the one bringing a complaint. When the door opened, Special Agent Janet Rivers walked in, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 40s with a reputation for thorough investigations. She greeted Vivian with a nod and took a seat across from her. "Vivian," Rivers said, her voice steady but tinged with concern, "I've read your initial report. What you went through, it's unacceptable. We're taking this very seriously." "I appreciate that," Vivian replied, though the weight of everything still pressed heavily on her. "But I don't want this to just be swept under the rug. I want a full investigation into those officers. What they did wasn't just a mistake. It was racial profiling, plain and simple." Rivers nodded, her expression serious. "I understand. And we will look into it. We've already begun gathering information on the two officers involved, Johnson and Wilson. It seems there have been complaints against them in the past, but nothing that led to any real consequences." Vivian wasn't surprised. Officers like Johnson and Wilson thrived in a system that protected them, that allowed them to continue their biased behavior without ever being held accountable. But this time, things were going to be different. She was determined to make sure of it. "I want to go public with this," Vivian said, her voice firm. "People need to know what's happening, not just to me, but to countless others who don't have the resources or the platform to fight back." Rivers hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. "We'll support you in that decision. But you know this won't be easy. Once you go public, there will be backlash, and not just against the officers, against you as well." Vivian knew that. She had seen it before, the way people in power twisted the narrative to protect themselves, to paint those who spoke out as troublemakers or agitators. But she wasn't going to back down. "I'm ready," she said simply. Rivers gave her a long, appraising look, then leaned forward. "We'll make sure everything is airtight. We'll dig into their records, their past complaints, and we'll expose the corruption that's been festering in that precinct for years. But you need to be prepared for the fallout." "I am," Vivian said, though deep down she knew it would be a hard fight. But it was one she couldn't afford to lose, not for herself, and not for the countless others who had been silenced by the system. The investigation moved swiftly. As the days passed, Vivian worked closely with Internal Affairs, providing every detail of her encounter with the officers. They gathered statements from witnesses, reviewed body camera footage, and unearthed a mountain of evidence showing a pattern of misconduct from Johnson and Wilson. It wasn't just about her arrest anymore. It was about years of abuse, of racial profiling, of a system that had turned a blind eye to corruption within its ranks. The media caught wind of the story, and soon it was everywhere. News outlets reported on the case, focusing not only on the injustice Vivian had faced, but on the broader issue of racial bias in policing. The footage of her arrest, captured by a witness outside the precinct, went viral. It showed the officers roughly handling her, dismissing her credentials, and mocking her status as a federal agent. the public outrage was immediate. But, as Rivers had warned, the backlash came quickly. Supporters of the police department rallied, accusing Vivian of using her race and status to create a scandal. Online, the vitriol poured in, comments attacking her character, her motives, and even her qualifications as an FBI agent. Some accused her of playing the race card, while others outright denied that racism had anything to do with it. Vivian refused to let it get to her. She had expected this. She knew that speaking out against a system as deeply entrenched as law enforcement would come with consequences, but she had allies too. Civil rights organizations reached out to offer their support, and activists rallied around her case, using it as a platform to demand broader reforms. The investigation into Johnson and Wilson uncovered more than even Vivian had anticipated. It turned out that the two officers had been involved in several incidents of misconduct, many of which had been quietly brushed under the rug. Complaints from Black and Latino citizens, accusations of excessive force, racial slurs used on duty. There was a clear pattern of abuse, all of it ignored by their superiors. And it didn't stop with Johnson and Wilson. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that the corruption went higher up the chain. Their precinct was riddled with officers who turned a blind eye to misconduct, and some were even involved in taking bribes from the very criminals they were supposed to be investigating. The weapons smuggling ring Vivian had been working to dismantle had connections within the department itself, a fact that sickened her to her core. This wasn't just about two rogue officers, it was about a system that had allowed them to thrive. And now, with the investigation in full swing, that system was finally being exposed for what it was. The media frenzy only grew as the details of the investigation came to light. Johnson and Wilson were suspended, pending further disciplinary action, but it was clear to everyone involved that their careers were effectively over. Their names had become synonymous with police corruption and racial bias, and their fall from grace was swift. But for Vivian, the battle wasn't just about taking down these two officers. It was about the countless other officers like them, the ones who operated in the shadows, protected by a system that refused to hold them accountable. She knew that this was just the beginning. The investigation would continue, and she would continue to fight, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been mistreated, profiled, or silenced. As she stood outside the FBI headquarters, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Vivian felt a deep sense of resolve. The road ahead would be long, filled with challenges and resistance, but she was ready. This wasn't just about a mission gone wrong, it was about justice. True justice. And Vivian Harris was determined to see it through. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more exposés and stories about the fight for justice, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. There are many more exciting stories to come. Click the bell so you don't miss new videos. And also check out our other stories. Just choose one of the videos on the screen.